You are listening to The Darker Sides of Life, a podcast by Hexekami. Hi, and welcome to a new episode of The Darker Sides of Life. I'm your host Camilla, or Hexekami, and this episode is about the loss of a parent. Before I start, I want to say that there are many ways to lose a parent, and I have personally experienced two kinds of losses. I'm today mainly focusing on the loss of my mother, who died when I had just turned 8, and in a future episode I will be talking about the loss of my father. He is not dead, but I have cut him out of my life because he's a narcissist who put me through literal hell growing up. Again, I will share that kind of loss and that story in a future episode. Today is about my mother, her death, my life with death as a companion, and how I am forever changed as a person because of this loss. Let's start with the beginning of the poem by Emily Dickinson written in 1890. It's called Because I Could Not Stop for Death and goes like this, quote, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality." End quote. I shared this since there's this sense of death as being a being, not only a concept, and that's exactly how I have felt about death ever since my mother died. I'll tell you about the day she passed and what it made me feel, and then I'll go on to talk about how this feeling has manifested itself throughout my life, growing up without her. My mother died on February 25 in 2001. It was a Sunday, and she died at 9:51 in the morning. I woke up to the death rattle she did in the hours leading up to her death. If you don't know what a death rattle is, it's a kind of gurgling sound that is produced because the body is no longer able to swallow or cough, so saliva builds up and the fluid creates a sound when air is passing through. I have to admit I feel a bit nauseated just thinking about this, and I don't think the further descriptions on how she died, what she smelled like and such are important for the emotional aspect of what I want to say today, so I'll stop sharing further details. What is important for my story is that I witnessed her die. My dad was there, so was my sister, and also my dad's mum, my grandma, who, as you know if you've listened to previous episodes, was my soulmate and the one who has taught me almost everything I know about life. My point is that I was not alone in watching my mother die, and while some people say when I tell them that I was there when my mum died, that I should have been taken out of the room because an experience like that is way too much for a child, I have to strongly disagree. I have spoken to so many people who have lost a parent or sibling at a similar age and who didn't see them die, or maybe also didn't even see the body of their loved ones after they had gone. From what I can gather from these stories is that those people had a very hard time understanding what had happened, what death was actually like. And how can you expect a child to grasp the concept and actions of death when they are denied the opportunity to experience it themselves? Yes, it is gruesome, and yes, of course children are better off not dealing with these matters, but when death strikes, no one should be denied the basic right to say goodbye in a way that can help them understand what happened, in my opinion. After my mother died, there was so much confusion in my life. My sister ran away from home, my father started working again, and being a pilot, he was not home with me. So I had to deal with many aspects of the loss on my own, and this led to me thinking of death as a being and not a concept. I think to my childhood mind, it made sense that someone, and not something, had come to get my mum. I didn't think the someone was scary, not at all. I had seen her die, and whilst the gurgling sounds were the worst sound I have ever heard, and even thinking about them now makes my heart break, it was very peaceful. So naturally, death was a peaceful someone, at least to me. I was 8 when my mother died, and I think the thought of death like a someone was just that for some years, but around the age of maybe 10, it evolved into a someone I could interact with. I remember not being able to fall asleep at night, and then praying to death and my mom to help me fall asleep. I faced the wall and closed my eyes. Then I wished and prayed that an angel, because I believed that death was an angel, would eventually come and sit on my bed behind my back and guard me so I could fall asleep, because death and I had become friends. You see, death was the one who explained to me what the concept of death was. It explained what had happened to my mom, and it made me feel good to know that wherever she had gone, this someone was there with her. I still have this sense of death. It's still one of my closest friends, for better and for worse. We've known each other for almost 21 years now, and we've cried and laughed together. In my teenage years, when I experienced puberty and turning into a woman with all the things the body does to become an adult, I really needed my mum to explain it all to me. My father didn't help me. My sister tried to, but she didn't live in Denmark, and my grandmother's advice seemed ancient. When she got her period, she knitted her sanitary pads and had no idea how to use the modern ones, so I asked Death. Now, you may be thinking, what the heck, Camilla? This makes no sense. Why is death linked to something like this? And I think the answer to that is that it is not linked at all, which is exactly why I asked it. I mean, wouldn't you ask a friend for help, even if they aren't experts in the topic you need assistance with? To me, death was a comforting creature, but this made me rather odd. Growing up with a personal understanding of the difference between life and death made me very different to my peers. I had a hard time getting real friends at school. It was difficult for me to care about the teenage obstacles and problems, since they seemed utterly easy to handle compared to what I had been dealing with since childhood. So I felt very lonely. Death is a silly friend that way. It kept me from being friends with life. And this is the part that is difficult for me to talk about, because what I realized was that I had to leave death behind for a while. I didn't know for how long, but I understood that if I wanted to be a part of what was happening around me, I needed to take part, and one cannot take part in life when the opposite is running through one's veins. So I did that. I left death behind. This may seem very confusing if you haven't experienced it yourself. What does this really mean? To me, it meant that I stopped talking to death. I stopped wishing for it to help me fall asleep and guard me at night. I basically ignored it, ignored my mother had passed, and that led to me forgetting her voice, forgetting her scent, forgetting how she would paint the most beautiful anemone again and again on large canvases. Forgetting how she would paint the most beautiful anemone again and again on large canvases that would smell like oil paint and acetone. I forgot how it felt to have a mum, what a mum was. And this I regret so very much, because while I now at age 29 have worked on getting some of these memories back, the sound of her voice is still lost. Her scent is completely gone, and how it felt to get a hug from her is something I artificially try to tell myself I remember, embarrassingly aware of the fact that I really don't. Today, I'm an adult. I figured out how to do those darn sanitary pads on my own, and I am able to look back and see how death shaped me into what I am today. And after the loss of my grandmother back in 2016, I started intense therapy, which helped me to reconcile with death and retrieve some of the memories lost. Now, I'm again sometimes talking to death in my head, just catching up with an old friend, seeing how they're doing, knowing we don't have to become one for me to feel connected to my mum. I think I truly separated myself from death in this way when my grandmother died, because here death came to visit again, and while I hated it for it, I was also in some ways greeted by a lost childhood friend who upon meeting again showed me that they were still there, for better or for worse. And that was in itself comforting. So I connect so much with Emily Dickinson's words, and I want to end today's episode with them, and this time reading a bit more of what I started the episode with. They go like this, quote, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labour and my leisure too, for his civility." End quote. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd truly appreciate it if you would take a moment to share it with your friends and leave a review and rating on iTunes. It helps me reach more people, and the only thing I want to do is reach those who need someone to tell them that they're not alone in the darker sides of life. Thank you for helping me and this podcast get out there. I have also set up a Ko-fi, so if you want to donate a few dollars to the podcast, there's a link for it in the description to this episode. Until next time, take care, and please remember that you are never alone in the darker sides of life. You've been listening to The Darker Sides of Life, a podcast by Hexekami.